now we are going to talk about our main topic here on Mastering Dungeons, our continuing look at 5th edition. We are in the Player's Handbook, and now we are looking at Chapter 11, the spells and the appendices that follow. So we talked about spell casting last time, which really covered a lot of the main content that we wanted to cover. But this chapter describes the most common spells in the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons. The chapter begins with the spell lists from the spellcasting classes, and the remainder contains the spell descriptions. They are presented in alphabetical order by the name of the spell.
All right, and this starts
now
our
someone
20...
noted...
Shawn, this is our 20-part series where we're going to go through the alphabetical list.
20-part series.
Right?
Right, absolutely. Except, hell no. We are not.
No.
We are not going to talk about every spell individually. But as someone noted on one of our platforms, that it's hard to call spellcasting in Magic an exception in this exception-based game because it is so voluminous. It is so important and powerful within the game. And that is true. But it is an exception because not everyone can do it. So it really reinforces the point that spellcasting is one of the main benefits to the D&D, and it is also one of the greatest drawbacks because it's those exceptions that need that playtesting the most. And this is a huge part of the game that is all exceptions to the rules. Yeah. So when we think back about some of the broken stuff that we talk about that has ruined games, in our own campaigns, or people have come up to us and said, yeah, what you said about that, this is the spell that ruins my game, or this is the thing that ruins my game. Like 90% of the time, it's a spell or a group of spells. Shield, Spirit Guardians, Banishment, Hypnotic Pattern, Simulacrum, right? All of those things that are often brought up as, that my campaign just came to a screeching halt, or combat is so bad because of these spells. Yeah, they're generally spells.
Yeah, it's true. The chapter does something that I think is sort of interesting, right? It groups spells for each class by level. And that may sound super obvious to anybody who's been looking at the Player's Handbook across the editions, because that's generally how things have worked. But, why is that, right? The benefit of spell lists is you can easily point to a player, whether they're new or experienced. Hey, here's your menu of options, right? And you get all the spells that you can take, and then you look them up in the alphabetical piece that follows. And that's usually a pretty good system, right? And the reason you do that is that you can cross-reference, because it might be that, Cure Wounds, Cure Light Wounds is something that appears on a cleric list, but maybe also on the bard list, and maybe also on the paladin list. And so by doing it that way, you get this very nice, clear menu of options in one place. You can look it up alphabetically in the other, and it all works. And you don't have to repeat it over and over again, or have some other organizational system that would be confusing, given how the game often ends up working. That hasn't been 100% true. So 4th edition took a different approach, right, where it had specific spell powers for each class, and those were listed like any other powers for classes, so they were confined and put together with the class. So that you certainly can use other methods, but the current one we see in 5th edition is the kind of approach we see most of D&D take, most of the D&D editions. D&D 1 changes it up slightly. So instead of class-based, it does power sources, right? So it looks at things like primal or arcane, and then it says this class has access to that list. And what we very quickly see is it then has to make a list of exceptions, right? You are a bard, you get these spells, but you can also get this spell at this level and this at this other. And hey, at this particular class level, you get to choose just another arcane spell, right? So it tries to give you this flexibility because it knows that the spell list now doesn't quite fit. And so it shows that the dangers of going away from our current system. Any thoughts on this, Shawn?
Yeah, spells have always been such a problematic thing for me. I very rarely play a spellcaster, just because I want a streamlined game. And of course, I've played spellcasters throughout all the editions.
Sure.
I've played like every class in every edition at one point. Um, but I love a quick narrative game. Even when it's tactical, I want it to be more about move here, do this, and let's move on. And for me, spellcasting has always been one of those, especially if you're a person who wants to make the optimal choice every time, uh, that it turns into a, well, let me go through my spell list. And then the ability to upcast spells makes that even more of a thing, because now it's not you have, 4 first level, 3 second level, and 2 third level spell slots. It's I can move up those first level spells into a third level slot.
Mhm.
So technically, if you could do that with every spell, now you have 9 choices at third level. Uh, and which one of those is optimal for this particular situation that may change when the character right before me acts. Uh, and so it's always been a very a system that I've accepted, but
Mm.
not necessarily enjoyed as a player.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, and it's hard because I think D&D has largely cemented itself on this approach, and when fourth edition took its approach, it received a lot of criticism for the idea that
Hmm.
now spells and attacks and class sort of the way the class exerted itself on the world now looked very similar in format, in approach, and in being balanced.
Hmm.
Even though what fourth edition did, and it did this in all aspects of play, not just in this one, was to say, hey, you've been complaining to us about how spells are just so wildly different than the rest of the game. So here it is when they're more similar, right? And everybody goes, oh, well, we hate that too. Right?
Yeah,
Because it is,
right.
nothing's perfect and it is hard, right? And and there are a
Yep.
lot of things when you look through these spells in fifth edition, and every edition has to do this, right? It has to say, okay, we've got these old spell lists. What do we bring forward? And it's generally the same things you
Hmm.
expect, right? Magic missile always, and shield always, and detect magic. But then it's like, well, we might make some tweaks, and you might tweak the schools of magic. You might tweak what level it is,
Hmm.
right? A little higher, a little lower sometimes. You modify the damage a little bit, right? Maybe it was too weak or too strong. You modify how a spell scales. So, like a spell, in fact, a lot of spells used to work the way Fireball used to work, which is that it would be a die of damage per level. And it might have a minimum because, well, it's a third level spell, but so you had to be fifth level to do that. But, now you see that it's not what is your spellcaster level, but it's based on the level that you cast it, and you can upcast it, as you mentioned. And now it's more dice each higher level you do, and that becomes a new
Hmm.
uniform system for upcasting, where it's either going to add a die of damage, or it's going to add another target, or some kind of simple way of scaling it up. And then
Hmm.
additions are always looking at whether a new spell should exist, right? And additions of the past have sometimes done this disastrously, where they create a new spell that's just so good that everybody's making use of it. And that you can also see the reverse. A spell
Yep.
that used to be, like say, grease, right, was super popular in third edition, and now it's just not good enough to
Yep.
cast. So you never see anyone cast grease, right? And color spray will be really strong in one edition, but now it's hypnotic pattern, right? And so just it's always fascinating, these tweaks
Yeah.
that happen to the spells.
Yeah. Yeah. And that just speaks back to the complicated nature of the system and the need to balance it versus the need to give the players who love complexity
Hmm.
that part of the game for them to play with. And I don't fault players that like that. I don't
No.
fault that, being in the game. It's just a personal preference on my part to, always try to move the game in a narrative direction, even just slightly in a narrative direction,
Well, and speaking
versus
to
a
that
mechanical one.
narrative direction, and also to George's question earlier, um,
Right.
the spells, there's an increasing desire by all games, not just D&D, to sort of codify more and standardize more and have sort of dependable language, and there are good reasons to do that. But what it also means
Hmm.
is that you end up with a real divergence between a lot of spells that are so very specific and narrowly interpreted, and then these sort of wilder spells, right? And so a good example, classic example, is illusions. And illusions have often driven DMs mad as they tried to consider what to do with this.
Hmm.
And so, imagine that you say, "Hey, I create an illusion of whatever, right? Some kind of monster, a troll." And what does that get me? That
Hmm.
answer has varied across any table, right? Like table A, B, C, D,
Right.
E, you get different questions on each one. One DM is going to be wildly on your side and go, "Oh yeah, all the goblins cower and they give up," and someone else is going to say,
Mhm.
one guy doesn't believe it's real, rolls to disbelieve, made it, now none of them believe. Another one's going to interact with
Mhm.
it, for a round, or all of the
Right.
goblins waste a round attacking with it, and then they conclude it's not real, right?
Right.
So you get this divergence.
Yep.
Do we want that divergence, right? How
Right.
important is it to
Yeah.
have this specific language?
Right. And that divergence is huge. I mean, Teos gave you a perfect example, but if we step back and think about that in terms of the mathematics
Mhm.
of the encounters of the game, right? What does what does obviously all the goblins giving up and running away, you've just won D&D, uh WON D&D. Uh, but if every goblin then wastes their attack on attacking this illusionary troll, that's basically like stunning or incapacitating all of those things. Now imagine if you said this first level spell, you can stun or incapacitate or take away the action of 20 creatures. You'd say
Yeah.
that spell's broken. But
Huh.
that's what some people, you know, try to get away with or allow. And narratively, that's fine, that's cool. But if you want this game to work mathematically, you have to find a way to cap that,
Yeah.
to put some guardrails around it. Otherwise, every player is like, well, we're all going to play illusionists, and
Right.
everyone will run away from these horrible creatures that we're making, and there's our campaign.
And it's true of the math as well, right? So like lightning bolt is a
Yeah.
spell that in previous editions could bounce off a wall and inflict its damage again.
Yeah.
And one of the funniest things was playing the gold box D&D video games where it
Oh
was
yeah.
not very good at letting you know what the angle was, and so it would bounce back and forth and probably
Right.
TPK your party. And so you would restore the game, put your caster in a slightly different place, cast a lightning bolt until you finally got it right. But at the
Yeah.
heart of it is the idea that this spell had the capacity to do way more damage than is written. Is that okay, right? And
Mhm.
what was concluded for the several editions is no, absolutely not. We're not okay with
Yeah.
that. And so lightning bolt is generally
Right.
weaker than fireball because we don't want that swinginess to exist, which is fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a decision we've made.
Yeah. And then we come to the conundrum of, spells that are more narrative focused. One of my one of my favorite things I've ever made is that Gift of Gab spell
Mm,
for Acquisitions
yes,
Incorporated.
love it.
And it was a spell that was meant to be sort of a joke, but not a joke, right?
Hmm.
It was a spell that was meant to not be not be mechanically powerful, but narratively powerful. And if the game master saw a way to make it be mechanically powerful, the game master could allow that to happen. If you're not aware, the Gift of Gab is a reaction where you can make creatures within a certain range. I think it's 30 feet. Forget the last thing you said for the last 6 seconds. So, in other words, if you say something idiotic and you realize that you can cast this as a reaction, and oh, they forgot that you said this insult, or you
Yeah.
accidentally gave away the location of your secret lair, or whatever. Um, and I cast it, or I created it sort of as a way for players to be joking at the table and say the things that they wish their character would say, and then use a spell slot to be able to get away with it
Yeah.
for humorous effect. Because I know that my group could really use that spell pretty
Oh
much
yeah.
at will if they
Mm,
so chose. Uh, but I love seeing like streaming groups using it.
yeah.
to do fun and different things,
Yeah.
um, and let game masters, like our question earlier, I think from George, was yeah, have it be more of a utility kind of spell that you can actually hinge a game on if you so choose.
Yeah. And it's great. I mean, I love it as a DM. I love when someone comes up with a great use of a spell, right? Like, if the monsters are coming down a rope and you cast grease on
Mhm.
that rope, I mean, that's amazing, right? Like, you just have to
Right.
conclude that, well, they're just, they're anyone on there is going to fall. I don't care what the check is. It's a grease covered rope, right? Like, forget about it. And those things are
Right.
great. But what so often happens when we cut down enough on those kinds of interactions is that nobody chooses grease in the first place. It's not even available to
Hmm.
cast it. So the perfect situation comes up for this, and no one uses it. And that's a shame because, as you said, magic and exceptions, it's not just an exception to the rules, but it's an exception to your general play. And even things that are
Right.
imperfect, right? Say, like, I remember I had a caster, I would often cast Stinking Cloud. One of the things I loved about it was the chaos that would ensue as it forced monsters to get out of their normal positioning on the map. They would have to
Hmm.
spread around this area and focus, and it just changes the dynamic of a battle in what is a really good way, even though generally some people are complaining about, like, oh, I can't fight that one thing or get to the whatever, but it changes it up in a
Right.
way that wakes everybody up and creates really nice interactions. And so I miss that, and I want more
The
of that. Yeah.
the perfect example of that, the last game I played as a player, I cast that into a room and we were waiting for the monsters to come out for us. But one of our players, of course, ran into the stinking cloud. And so we can't see this character and got paralyzed by the monster. And so we know as players that this is happening. And one of the players
Oh.
says, "Boy, do you think he's in trouble?" And I said, "He'd yell if he was in trouble." Right. And so we're all like, okay. And so he's getting absolutely demolished in the room. And we're just like, well, yeah, we'll wait for them to come out, and bad things happen. But that's the fun, like you said, of
Yeah.
having these spells that change the normal way that you
Yeah.
think about the game. And I love to see that sort of play.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I'll take the balance being imperfect if it's creative enough, right? Yeah.
Hmm. Right. Right. Any other thoughts on spells in general? I really wish we had the time and the energy to go spell by spell, but that is not
Yeah.
where our headspace is going to be
Mm-mm.
for a bit. And so I'm sure that there are podcasts and streams out there where people dive into spells, and if you are interested in that sort of granularity, please go assuage your curiosity.
Mhm.
So, next time we will talk about the appendices of the player's handbook, including things like conditions and gods of the multiverse, the planes, statistics, and inspirational reading. But with that, we want to thank you for listening. Thank you also to the people who have joined our Patreon. You are keeping the lights on for us, and we really do appreciate that. Whether you're a Master of Dungeons supporter, or a Master of the Realm supporter who gets a shout out in our show notes, or a Master of the Multiverse patron who gets a shout out right now. And that includes Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Robin Durmy, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Laitman, Shawn Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Adrian Marquez at Post Fiction RPG Audio, Eric Mengi, the Micro Ant, Falcon Neal, Chance Russo, Krishna Simone Say, Joe Tyler, James Walton, Graham Ward, and John Wilson. You too can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. If you're not a patron, we still appreciate your support. If you could go to Apple Podcast or use whatever podcatcher that you are listening on to give us a review, because that helps us become a little bit more visible. And if you're on YouTube, well, you can always leave a comment there. and gaze at our beautiful visages. So, Teos, where can people find you?
Yeah. Twitter has shut down third-party apps, or most of them. So I can no longer use my Twitterific app. So I'm less and less on Twitter, or very imperfectly, and I may not see anything you send me. So the place to find me is really now Mastodon, AlphaStream at dice.camp. Uh, my blog, alphastream.org, is the place to find all my latest works. Shawn, what about you? Where do we find you?
I am still on Twitter for the time being at Shawn Merwin. The podcast is also on Twitter, so you can check us out there at Mastering D&D. The podcast is also on Mastodon at dice.camp, and I am on Mastodon at Shawn Merwin at tabletop.social. You can also find us on the YouTube channel Mastering Dungeons, and of course on Patreon. So, Teos, we are continuing to navigate the OGL and continuing to work our way through fifth edition. So, what do you think we should do now?
Well, honestly, I'm going to go back to Tatum Bay's question, because I think I'm going to get the term designated okay enough forever GM as a t-shirt.
Oh, I could use the t-shirt, the hat, the socks, and all of that.